In the mid-19th century, tens of thousands of British, Welsh and Scandinavians crowded the docks at Liverpool to take a one-way ocean voyage to America. These immigrants dreamed of a new life, a new beginning. For the most part, these religious immigrants were poor. They would pull wooden handcarts loaded with only what they needed to survive as they crossed the Great Plains and the Rockies.
To travel the whole voyage at the cost of about £20 from Liverpool to the Salt Lake Valley, that would represent more than a year's salary for an individual.
In all its history, the American West never saw a more unlikely band of pioneers. Most of them, until they were herded from their crowded immigrant ship, had never pitched a tent, slept on the ground, cooked outdoors, built a campfire. They had not even the rudimentary skills that make frontiersmen. Wallace Stegner.
This was an experiment. This handcart business was an experiment. First year it had ever been tried.
Lots of people walked west, but no one ever had done an organized, outfitted handcart trek across to the west.
There were 5 handcart companies in 1856. The first 3 companies arrived at Iowa City at the end of March and mid-April.
The first shiploads of immigrants that were using the handcart plan got to Iowa City. They just had to wait. Nothing was ready for them. And so any of the craftsmen that came across on these ships were immediately put to work in building handcarts.
Completing construction of so many handcarts stalled the immigrants getting out on the trail. They finally left in June and arrived in the valley without serious incident late September and early October. But the last 2 companies, captained by James G. Willey and Edward Martin, were not so fortunate.
July 24th. We have travelled upwards of 1,700 miles by railway to this place. For the last fortnight, we have been living in a tent. James Blake, Iowa City.
The 3 handcart companies ahead of them had depleted the supplies of seasoned lumber in Iowa City, as had the building boom in the community.
We expected to find these handcart vehicles already at hand on our arrival at Iowa City. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson.
Precious weeks passed before the handcarts and tents were completed. The first leg of the journey, 277 miles from Iowa City to Florence, Nebraska, took 4 weeks. Willey's company arrived August the 11th. Martin's on the 22nd. A few who had been to the valley were wary of travel so late in the season and urged wintering in Nebraska.
We cannot cross the mountains with a mixed company of aged people, women, and little children so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death. Levi Savage.
The emigrants were entirely ignorant of the country and climate. Simple, honest, eager to go to Zion at once. John Chislett, Willey Company.
A few leaders were still hesitant to continue the journey. About 100 people chose to stay behind in Nebraska.
They knew that they were late. Everybody knew that they were late. Richards frankly admitted that he anticipated that they would have some snow.
From the outset, clear back in 1847, it was very clearly stated that they must get an early start. Early enough so they could get all the way across during the summer months. This was the cardinal guideline. And unfortunately, it was ignored.
Company leaders determined to push on, trusting a divine hand would temper the elements and shore up the travelers.
Seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in His mercy bless and preserve us. Levi Savage, Willey Company.
Something in their soul kept them coming. Even though all common sense would say, hey, just stop here. And they didn't.
Saturday, August 26th. We started with our handcart this morning. James Blake, Martin Company.
Each person was allotted 17 pounds of personal belongings. A handful of wagons carrying supplies and tents trailed behind the carts. In addition, 385 immigrants who could afford teams traveled behind the Martin Company in either the 33 wagons with W.B. Hodgett or the 50 wagons with John A. Hunt. Soon the monotony and rigor of the trail wore down the emigrants.
We continued our toil day after day, pulling our handcarts with our provisions or rations, our little children, etc., through deep sands, rocky roads, or fording streams. It was a dreary journey. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
The carts broke down as the unseasoned lumber dried out and shrank. Sand and rocks ground down the wheels and axles. Repairs caused further delays. Their troubles worsened when on the night of September 3rd, a violent thunderstorm and a buffalo stampede scattered their cattle. The loss of the Willey Company's livestock signaled disaster.
We hunted for our livestock 3 days in every direction, but did not find them. John Chislett, Willey Company.
Through losing our cattle and having to camp on the plains for several weeks, it threw us late in the season and made our provisions short for the latter part of our journey. Susanna Stone, Willey Company.
Willey, fully aware that they were running out of time, said that they would go on. But they were definitely hampered by not having these animals. They had to hitch heifers and milk cows to their wagons just to keep moving. Their progress was slowed by at least a third, maybe almost in half. Now the Martin Company, when they left Florence, it was late enough in the year that, in my opinion, they were doomed from the beginning.
September 8th. We travelled 18 miles over a very heavy road. No watering place. James Blake, Martin Company.
Traveling fast in light wagons, Immigration Agent Franklin D. Richards and about a dozen returning missionaries passed the Martin and Willey Companies on the trail. Richards promised to send food and supplies from Salt Lake as soon as he arrived. By early September, the emigrants were beginning to run out of food.
On September 30, we arrived at Fort Laramie, having necessarily expended considerable time in the repair of handcarts. John Chislett, Willey Company.
Due to the lateness of the season, Fort Laramie's shelves were bare of food supplies except for a couple of barrels of crackers and a bit of bacon.
October 8th. Our old people are nearly all failing fast. Levi Savage, Willey Company.
Shortly after leaving Fort Laramie, it became necessary to shorten our rations that they might hold out, and that the company be not reduced to starvation. The reduction was repeated several times. We pushed ahead. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
It was ascertained that at our present rate of travel and consumption of flour, the latter would be exhausted when we were about 350 miles from our destination. John Chislett, Willey Company.
Those who knew the trail could not ignore the heavy frost on the ground each morning. They were cold, hungry, and utterly exhausted from pulling the carts and taking their turn at guard duty. No relief was in sight.
The mountains before us revealed themselves to view, mantled nearly to their base in snow, and tokens of a coming storm were discernible in the clouds, which each day seemed to lower around us. John Chislett, Willey Company.
Strips of burlap or canvas replaced worn-out shoes. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Their ragged clothing, wet from river crossings, never dried one day to the next.
October 14th. Some would sit down by the roadside and die. My younger sister Caroline, 17 years old, after travelling all day, took off her apron to tie some sagebrush in. They found her chilled and dying and carried her into camp. She was placed in an unmarked grave. Robert Reeder, Willie Company.
October 16th. Our rations of flour was reduced from 1 pound to 12 ounces for adults and 8 ounces for my children to 6 ounces a day. James Blake, Martin Company.
There was not enough food to maintain the body heat they required. There was not enough bedding or clothing to keep them warm, particularly at night. They became exhausted, and this brought them down.
October 17th. Good blankets and other bedding and clothing were burned as they could not be carried further. There was yet 400 miles of winter to go through. John Jakes, Martin Company.
They had to lighten their loads to take this load off their men to give them a better chance of surviving, because it was mostly the men that were dying. So the loads were lightened, and everything that wasn't absolutely essential was burned. Even some essential things were burned, bedding and warm clothing, but just because they couldn't carry it anymore.
October 18th, fourth crossing of the Sweetwater. The air is cool. Levi Savage, Willie Company.
October 19th. We crossed the Platte, very trying in consequence of its width and the cold weather. James Blake, Martin Company.
Men, women and children waded through the current, many needing assistance. And then the snow, hail and wind came.
We were overtaken by a snowstorm, which the shrill wind blew furiously about us. The snow fell several inches deep as we travelled along, but we dared not stop. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Winter came all at once, and that was the first day of it. John Jakes, Martin Company.
The weather hit then, the sleet, the snow. They were already wet from the crossing. The wetness froze on their bodies, which is the worst thing that can happen in cold weather, is to be wet. And so that very first night we have a large number of deaths, but we don't know. We have some people saying that there were 14 the night after they had crossed.
We had to travel in our wet clothes until we got to camp. Our clothing was nearly frozen on us. That night the ground was frozen so hard we were unable to drive any tent pins in, and the tent was wet. We stretched the tent open and got under it until morning. Patience Loader, Martin Company. I listened to hear my husband breathe. He lay so still. Put my hand on his body, when to my horror I discovered that my worst fears were confirmed. He was cold and stiff, rigid in the arms of death. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
It was just cold, and cold can kill you, especially if you're trying to survive, and if you're a man trying to provide for your family. You're expending energy, and that can sap your strength enough to where when the night comes, you may not be there in the morning.
They did not remove my husband's clothing. He had but little. They wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a pile with 13 others who had died, and then covered him up with snow. The ground was frozen so hard that they could not dig a grave. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
The crossing of the North Platte was fraught with more fatalities than any other incident of the entire journey. Josiah Rogerson, Martin Company.
Both the Willie and Martin companies reached, as I can see, a breaking point on the 18th and 19th of October. Interestingly, both at the same time, before the storm struck.
October 4th, Franklin D. Richards rode into the Salt Lake Valley with distressing news. There were as many as 1,200 emigrants still out on the plains. President Young called for the men, horse, and mule teams to stage an immediate rescue. He asked the women to bring food, blankets, and clothing of any description to fill the wagons.
The sisters stripped off their petticoats, stockings, and everything they could spare. Lucy Meservey Smith, Salt Lake City.
Tuesday, October 7th. The first wagons and teamsters, headed by Captain George D. Grant, began the climb up the steep canyon heading east.
The idea of the rescuers, they're going out and they haven't even got a clue where Willie is and his people, or Martin. It's this idea, we're going to go out and try to rescue these people, but we don't even know what we're facing.
The leaders of the rescue were trail-seasoned men. With them were a select group of young men who had tended cattle, logged, plowed, irrigated, ferried mail, and a few had clashed with Indians.
A better outfit and one more adapted to the work before us I do not think could have possibly been selected if a week had been spent fitting it up. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
Weeks later, more teams loaded with additional tons of flour and other provisions joined the rescue. Estimates projected that Captain Willie and his company might be found 2 days past Fort Bridger, about 130 miles east of Salt Lake.
October 15th. Our hearts began to ache when we reached Green River, and yet no word of them. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
The rescue party kept riding, bewildered that the handcart companies were so far back on the trail.
This relief party proceeded eastward as rapidly as possible, and in due time passed over the South Pass, the backbone of the continent. Harvey Clough, Rescue.
October 18th. No sign of the handcart companies. Captain Grant stationed Reddick Allwood, 11 men and 4 supply wagons at South Pass to restock the relief companies when they returned with the emigrants. He had earlier dispatched 4 express riders to find the 2 companies and assure them help was on its way. On horseback, the express riders could make more than 30 miles a day.
As they continued on across southwestern Wyoming and then towards South Pass, the weather had held, but right around the South Pass area we have the weather start falling apart. And just on the east side of South Pass, the rescue teams experience a terrible snowstorm, and they have to take shelter.
The raging winter storm brought the rescuers and both handcart companies to a standstill. The Willie Company on the Sweetwater and the Martin Company at the North Platte, more than 100 miles apart.
The storm raged with increasing fury until it reached the capacity of a northern blizzard. Harvey Clough, Rescue.
The express riders from Captain Grant's rescue party were riding hard. They finally found the Willie Company camped on the Sweetwater.
October 19th. Met Brother Wheelock and company, who have come to our relief. He reported 40 loads of flour 1 day in advance of us. This was joyful news. Levi Savage, Willie Company.
Being surrounded by snow a foot deep, out of provisions, many of our people sick, and our cattle dying. It was decided that we should remain at our present camp until the supply train reached us. John Chislett, Willie Company.
October 20th. The snow, increasing in depth daily, seemed to drag the life completely out of us all. And from the last crossing of the Platte, we commenced to bury the exhausted, rapidly. Josiah Rogerson, Martin Company.
The express had found the Willie Company out of food, and desperate.
Such craving hunger I never saw before, and may God in his mercy spare me the sight again. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Captain Willie with 21-year-old Joseph Elder left their camp to search for the promised aid. They spent several hours on the trail, uncertain of the rescue wagon's location.
For protection of ourselves and animals, the company moved down the river to where the willows were dense enough to make a good protection against the raging storm from the north. I volunteered to take a signboard and place it at a conspicuous place at the main road. This was designed to direct the express party, who were expected to return about this time, so they would not miss us. I had only been back to camp a short time when two men rode up from Willie's Handcart Company. The signboard had done the work of salvation. Harvey Clough, rescue.
Joseph Elder and Captain Willie would have gone right past the rescuers. You can't see the trail from where the rescuers were.
The report that they get from Captain Willie is that they have to get to these people, and so the very next day they're on their way racing ahead to rescue the Willie Company. So that sign post on the road was definitely a lifesaver.
October 21. Just as the sun was sinking beautifully, behind the distant hills, on an eminence immediately west of our camp, several covered wagons, each drawn by 4 horses, were seen coming towards us. Shouts of joy rent the air. John Chislett, Willie Company.
When the people of the camp sighted us approaching, they set up such a shout as to echo through the hills. Harvey Clough, rescue.
We found them in a condition that would stir the hardest heart. They were out of provisions, freezing, and starving to death. Daniel W. Jones, rescue.
The men from the valley turned over to me flour, potatoes, onions, and a limited supply of warm clothing, besides quilts, blankets, buffalo robes, woolen socks. That evening, for the first time in quite a period, the songs of Zion were to be heard in the camp. John Chislett, Willie Company.
In my opinion, had the rescue not come when it did, within 48 hours of the storm on the 19th of October, the death would have begun to skyrocket.
Our help came too late for some, and many died after our arrival. Daniel W. Jones, rescue.
We know that many of them perished before the rescuers got there, and so their time was short. They probably could not have gone much more than a week before the rescuers got to them.
A week or more, there's at least a possibility that everyone would have perished. There certainly would have been great catastrophe. The timing of the rescue is stunning.
6 well-loaded wagon teams and teamsters were left with the company, and the rest of us pushed on, for as yet we had no information as to where the other handcart and 2 independent wagon companies were. Harvey Clough, rescue.
By now, the rescuers had been on the trail for weeks, and their own provisions were nearly gone.
Having seen the sufferings of Brother Willie's company, we more fully realized the danger the others were in. Daniel W. Jones, rescue.
The rescue party was not sparing their horses. They were moving as fast as they could, literally running their stock into the grave in order to get to the stranded handcart people before they were all in the grave.
Captain George D. Grant's rescue party of 8 wagons and about twice that many men rushed east, hoping to find the Martin, Hunt, and Hodgett companies camped near the 4-year-old stockade at Devil's Gate. There they met the express riders, but there was no sign of the emigrants. Meanwhile, October 23rd, the Willie Company faced a 5-mile climb up Rocky Ridge in the snow.
I had not gone far up before I overtook a cart that the folks could not pull through the snow. I helped them along and we soon overtook another. By all hands getting to one cart we could travel, so we moved one of the carts a few rods, and then went back and brought up another. Thus by travelling twice forward and once back, I succeeded in bringing my little company to the summit. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Even with help, many could not make it. Chislett and others went back and forth on the trail, bringing in stragglers until 5 in the morning.
A fierce wind and driving snow met these folks just as they're crossing arguably the most difficult part of the entire Mormon Trail. My calculation is that the wind chill equivalent was probably 70 below zero. It's hard to imagine how they were able to get through that terrible day. And it was a long day, all evening, all night long. The rear elements didn't get in until dawn was breaking the next morning.
There were so many dead and dying that it was decided to lie by for the day. In the forenoon, I was pointed to go round and collect the dead. 13 corpses, all stiffly frozen. John Chislett, Willey Company.
There's been speculation that it wouldn't have really been necessary for the handcart companies, for the Willey Company, to have gone on what amounts to a forced march. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the rescue group, the hardest part of the trip was yet ahead of them, and that was crossing the Wasatch Mountains. And one real good snowstorm would have closed those roads over the Wasatch. So they needed to get down the trail and get over those mountains as quickly as possible.
Meanwhile, the Martin Company had floundered after crossing the North Platte.
Thursday, 23rd of October. We've travelled 5 miles. For several days we have been weatherbound in consequence of a heavy fall of snow. Friday the 24th, no travelling. Saturday the 25th, no travelling. Our rations reduced to 8 ounces of flour for adults and 4 ounces for children. James Blake, Martin Company.
I was 6,000 or 7,000 miles from my native land, in a wild, rocky mountain country, in a destitute condition, the ground covered with snow, the waters covered with ice, and I with 3 fatherless children, with scarcely nothing to protect them from the merciless storms. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
Ahead on the trail, the Willey Company began to move again towards the valley.
October 25th. We commenced our march again. Nothing much of note transpired, except people died daily. Levi Savage, Willey Company.
The Martin Company was still trapped in the snow at Red Buttes, the wagon trains behind them.
Sunday the 26th, no travelling. Monday the 27th, no travelling.
While Captain Grant and the wagons waited at Devil's Gate Stockade, 3 express riders on fast horses were searching for the Martin Company.
We saw a white man's shoe track in the road. Brother Young called out, "Here they are." We put our animals to the utmost speed and soon came in sight of the camp at Red Bluff. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
Tuesday the 28th of October, when they first made their appearance, I do not think there was one in camp but shed tears of joy. James Blake, Martin Company.
Many declared we were angels from heaven. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
The 3 walked through what seemed to be a frozen death camp. Word spread that wagons, food, and supplies were only 3 days' distance. With resignation, the half-frozen, starving emigrants began again next morning.
A condition of distress here met my eyes that I never saw before or since. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
The 3 express scouts, Joseph A. Young, Abel Garr, and Daniel W. Jones, began leading the suffering emigrants toward Devil's Gate and the waiting rescue wagons.
The train was strung out for 3 or 4 miles. There were old men pulling and tugging their carts, sometimes loaded with a sick wife or children. Women pulling along sick husbands. Little children 6 to 8 years old struggling through the mud and snow. As night came, the mud would freeze to their clothes and feet. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
They're dying on a daily basis. We don't know how many, but people are dying every day as they struggle 5, 6, 7, 10 miles a day trying to get to Devil's Gate.
November the 1st. There was a foot or 18 inches of snow on the ground. As there were but 1 or 2 spades in camp, the emigrants had to shovel the snow with their frying pans or tin plates before they could pitch their tents. And the ground was frozen so hard that it was almost impossible to drive the tent pegs into it. John Jakes, Martin Company.
The snow lay several inches deep upon the ground. The night was bitterly cold. I sat down on a rock with one child in my lap and on each side of me. In that condition I remained until morning. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
Captain Grant and the main rescue party moved east and met the last handcart train at Greasewood Creek, a day's ride from Devil's Gate. They dispensed supplies, inadequate for the numbers, but gratefully received.
You can imagine between 500 and 600 men, and women, and children, worn down by drawing handcarts through snow and mud, fainting by the wayside, falling, chilled by the cold. We have prayed without ceasing, and the blessing of God has been with us. Captain George D. Grant, Greasewood Creek.
The rescuers began again, leading the Martin, Hunt, and Hodgett companies towards Devil's Gate.
November the 2nd. We arrived at Devil's Gate that night to camp in the snow, which was deep and freezing. We found several big fires there and several log huts. John Jakes, Martin Company.
Every room, nook, and corner was taken. Wagons and tents were filled to their utmost capacity. Harvey Clough, Rescue.
Ahead on the trail, the Willey Company pushed on to the valley. They left all but a few of their handcarts at Fort Bridger.
November 2nd. We found a great many teams at Fort Bridger that had come to our help. All our company rode. This day I also rode for the first time on our journey. John Chislett, Willey Company.
The final days of the Willey Company's journey continued to be marked by death and cold.
Peter Madsen from Copenhagen, age 66 years, died during the day. The snowstorm came on this evening. Willey Company Journal.
In a letter to Brigham Young, carried by 2 express riders, Captain Grant reported the last handcart and wagon companies had been found. November 3rd. The rescuers and leaders from the Martin, Hunt, and Hodgett companies met to determine whether to winter at Devil's Gate or try to reach the valley. With supplies insufficient, the leaders decided to press on to Salt Lake, leaving many of the handcarts and the freight from the Hunt and Hodgett wagons as well.
A unanimous vote was taken that all would be willing to do as they were instructed, even if it was required of them to leave all they had behind and be glad to get into the valley with their lives only. Hunt Company Journal, Devil's Gate.
Our company is too small to help much. It is only a drop to a bucket in comparison to what is needed. I think that not over 1/3 of Brother Martin's company is able to walk. We will move every day toward the valley, if we shovel snow to do it, the Lord helping us. Captain George D. Grant, Devil's Gate.
November 4th. The emigrants and rescuers began to move to a nearby cove for shelter. But first they had to cross the Sweetwater.
For many, it was a frightening experience, the thought of going into the water. They recalled vividly in their mind what had happened when they'd crossed the Platte about 16 days earlier on the day the storm overtook the company. While there was little bits of ice on the Platte, now there were large chunks in the water.
The crossing of the Sweetwater at this point was the worst river crossing of the expedition, and the last. The ice was 3 or 4 inches thick, Before the crossing was completed, the shades of evening were closing around, the coldest hour of the 24. Or at least it seemed to be so. John Jakes, Martin Company.
The river was only about 2 or 3 feet deep. It's only about 30 feet wide as far as the crow flies. But the ford that they had to take was substantially longer. So they were in the water for a period of time greater than just 30 or 40 feet. For most, they were able to do it on their own. We know names of 5, and there may have been more, that were there to help those who were having trouble getting across on their own. They would carry them across.
Our ration of flour was reduced to 4 ounces and 2 ounces for children, making £1 a day for the 6 of us. James Blake, Martin Company.
Temperatures dropped by more than 10 degrees below zero. For 5 days, they waited it out in a nearby cove, and they buried their dead.
It was so cold that some of the company came near freezing to death. The sufferings of the people were fearful, and nothing but the power of a merciful God kept them from perishing. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
That same period, the Willey Company neared the end of the trail.
It snowed most of the day. The camping ground presented a most dismal appearance as we rolled on to it, late at night. Willey Company Journal.
November 9th, the Willey Company entered the valley, receiving a somber reception. Settlers opened their homes and took in the members of this 4th Handcart Company. The sun was shining.
Our toilsome journey was hard to endure, but the Lord gave us strength and courage. Susanna Stone, Willey Company.
Back at Devil's Gate, Daniel W. Jones and 19 men were appointed to stay behind and guard the belongings unloaded from the Hunt and Hodgett wagon train. The wagons were now needed to help transport the Martin Company.
There was not money enough on earth to have hired me to stay. But I remembered my assertion that any of us would stay if called upon. I could not back out. Daniel W. Jones, Rescue.
Daniel W. Jones and his men stayed the winter, 5 months, living on very little, resorting to roasting rawhide to stay alive.
Captain George D. Grant wanted the 20 left at Devil's Gate to sleep with one eye open and one leg out of bed, for there were devils, mountaineers, and Indians round about here. John Jakes, Martin Company.
November 9th, the weather broke, and the desperate emigrants left the ravine and headed for the valley. The wagons carried the weak and ill. Still, most had to walk.
Nearly all the handcarts had been left behind. James Blake, Martin Company.
The great object now was to save as many of the people as possible. It was a trying time that day, leaving the ravine. One perplexing difficulty was to determine who should ride, for many must still walk. There was considerable crying of women and children, and perhaps a few of the men, whom the wagons could not accommodate with a ride. John Jakes, Martin Company.
November 10th. Just before sunset, seasoned trail rider Ephraim Hanks, riding one horse and leading another laden with buffalo meat, rode toward the train.
The starved forms and haggard countenances of the poor sufferers, as they moved about slowly shivering with cold, to prepare their scanty evening meal, was enough to touch the stoutest heart. Ephraim Hanks, rescue.
There was no mitigation of the piercing, wintry cold. John Jakes, Martin Company.
Many of the immigrants whose extremities were frozen lost their limbs. Ephraim Hanks, rescue.
November 12th. At 3 crossings on the Sweetwater, 4 wagons loaded with flour and supplies met the Martin Company.
November 14th. No deaths in camp tonight. Robert T. Burton, rescue.
November 16th. 10 more rescue wagons met the Martin Company at the top of Rocky Ridge.
November 17th. We shall travel by mule teams to the valley, leaving the ox teams behind, and expect to travel between 20 to 25 miles a day. James Blake, Martin Company.
Now in wagons, the Martin Company reached the Bear River on November 25th. Progress to the valley was rapid, though deaths continued. At Big Mountain, a handful of rescuers, including Joseph A. Young, were keeping the road open by tramping down the waist-deep snow with ox teams. 20-foot drifts lined parts of the canyon road leading to the valley. November 30th. As Sunday meetings concluded, 104 wagons carrying the members of the Martin Company rolled into Salt Lake City.
I felt to rejoice greatly and give praise to God for my safe arrival with my wife and children after a journey of 6 months and 1 week. James Blake, Martin Company.
I think the tally is somewhere around 69, 70 deaths in the Willie Company, whereas the Martin Company possibly as many as 3 times that number.
Relief teams carrying the Hunt and Hodgett companies straggled into the valley between December the 11th and 15th. Their arrival concluded the ordeal for some 1,200 emigrants.
There's no doubting that it was the worst tragedy in the history of the Oregon Trail.
The winter setting in at least a month early, and the mistake of starting us a month too late, are the main causes of that calamity. Josiah Rogerson, Martin Company.
The journey with its great and incessant toils, its wearing hardships and wasting privations, was a hard and bitter experience, wholly unanticipated. Whom do I blame for the misadventure? I blame nobody. I have no doubt that those who had to do with the management meant well, and tried to do the best they could. John Jakes, Martin Company.